Hey everyone, before we dive into today's intense story, I want to know, where are you all from? Comment below, and let's see how far our community reaches. Globe showing Europe, Africa. If you're someone who enjoys gripping stories of betrayal, revenge, and the drama that unfolds when trust is shattered, you're in the right place. Unheard Stories brings you untold tales of infidelity, heartbreak, and the twists that follow. And trust me, today's story is going to hit you hard. Imagine being in a loving marriage, believing everything is perfect, until one day, everything falls apart. In today's story, we follow David and Sarah, a married couple who seemed to have it all, until betrayal tore their world apart. Sarah, feeling neglected and ignored, sought comfort elsewhere with Lucas, her personal trainer. But what happens when David finds out? Well, it's not just about revenge. It's about regaining control, and David's response will leave you speechless. So, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss out on any of the intense stories we share here. Now, sit back and let's dive into this roller coaster of emotions. Trust me, you won't want to miss this. David and Sarah had always been the couple everyone admired. On the surface, their life seemed perfect, an ideal marriage built on love, trust, and shared dreams. But like many things that appear flawless, their relationship had begun to crack beneath the surface. David was a successful businessman in his late 30s, focused on building his empire. He had always been driven, passionate about his career, and deeply committed to providing for his wife. His charm and confidence made him the center of attention wherever he went, but his dedication to work often kept him away from home. Late nights at the office, endless meetings, and travel for business had become the norm for him. At first, Sarah had understood. After all, they were building a future together, and David's success was their shared success. But over time, Sarah began to feel a growing emptiness. Sarah, in her early 30s, was beautiful, intelligent, and fiercely independent. She had everything a woman could ask for, except for the one thing she craved most: attention. When she married David, she had hoped for a partnership, a deep emotional connection, and shared moments of intimacy. But the longer David's career flourished, the more Sarah felt pushed aside. She was left alone in their luxurious home, waiting for him to come back, only to be met with distant conversations and hurried pecks on the cheek. As the days turned into months, Sarah found herself looking for fulfillment elsewhere. She loved David, but the connection they once shared was becoming a distant memory. It wasn't that she wanted to hurt him. She just wanted to feel seen, to feel alive again. And that's when Lucas, her personal trainer, entered the picture. Lucas was everything David wasn't. He was spontaneous, charming, and most importantly, he paid attention to Sarah. In her weekly training sessions, Lucas made her feel special, noticed, and alive in a way she hadn't felt in years. At first, it was innocent. A few compliments here and there, some light flirtation. But as the weeks passed, their connection deepened. What began as an escape from her lonely reality turned into something more. Soon, Lucas became her confidant, someone she could talk to about anything and everything. Before long, their professional relationship crossed into personal territory. It wasn't long before they were sneaking around, meeting after hours, and sharing stolen moments of passion. Sarah justified her actions. She had been patient with David, she told herself. She had tried to be the perfect wife, supporting his career, maintaining their home, and keeping up appearances. But her emotional needs were being neglected. Lucas made her feel important, desirable, and heard. She found herself wanting more from him, and it was a craving that was slowly becoming impossible to ignore. Meanwhile, David remained blissfully unaware. His focus remained on his business, on building their future together, and on providing Sarah with the life he believed she wanted. But the cracks in their marriage were widening, and David didn't see it. He didn't realize that Sarah was slipping away, pulled by a magnetic force that he could no longer compete with. Their routines continued, but the distance between them grew. David would come home late, and Sarah would be there, waiting, physically present, but emotionally distant. Their conversations became surface level, revolving around trivial things, while the deeper connection they once had faded into the background. But little did David know, Sarah's secret was about to come to light. As the affair with Lucas continued, Sarah began to feel the weight of her actions. She had betrayed David's trust, and yet, she couldn't bring herself to stop. She felt torn between the man she had loved for so long and the new, exciting life she was building with Lucas. But as she lived in the thrill of secrecy, the guilt was beginning to set in. Sarah had no idea that her world, and the life she had built with David, was about to come crashing down. Her secret was about to be uncovered in a way she never expected. Sarah had never expected to fall this deep into the affair. What started as innocent flirtation, light-hearted compliments, and the thrill of feeling noticed, had quickly spiraled into something much darker. With every passing day, her feelings for Lucas grew stronger, and the guilt began to fade into the background, drowned by the excitement and the passion she now felt whenever they were together. It wasn't just the physical attraction that drew her in. Lucas made her feel heard in ways David no longer could. When they spoke, Lucas listened attentively, his eyes never leaving hers. He made her feel like the most important person in the room, a feeling that had become increasingly rare in her marriage. Their encounters started innocently, training sessions that left her breathless, their conversations lingering longer than necessary. But soon, their meetings turned into more than just a workout. Lucas would find reasons to suggest they stay for a coffee after a session, or they'd go for a walk under the guise of discussing her fitness goals. Then, one evening after a particularly intense workout, the lines blurred completely. One simple kiss, and everything changed. At first, Sarah tried to justify it. "It's just a mistake," she told herself. "I'm not doing anything wrong. David never pays attention to me anymore." But as the affair continued, it became clear that Sarah was no longer just seeking physical release. She was emotionally invested in Lucas. He had become her escape, her source of validation, the excitement she had been craving for so long. The affair wasn't always passionate or dramatic. Sometimes it was just about the emotional connection they shared. After a long day of pretending everything was fine with David, Sarah would sneak away to Lucas, where she could be herself. She could speak openly about her frustrations with David, about how he no longer made her feel desired or important. Lucas would listen, offering words of comfort, and before long, his arms would wrap around her, comforting her in ways David never had. Meanwhile, David remained completely in the dark. He had no idea that his wife had been stepping out on him, emotionally and physically. He was consumed by his work, still thinking that their relationship was stable, that they were just going through a rough patch, nothing too serious. He noticed Sarah's increasing distance, but he chalked it up to her being tired or stressed from her own work or personal life. He didn't know that there was another man filling the void, one who was slowly, but surely, winning Sarah's heart. The cracks in their marriage deepened, but neither Sarah nor David knew just how close they were to a breaking point. Sarah tried to push the guilt aside, convincing herself that she was justified in her actions. She told herself that David wasn't the man she thought he was anymore, that their marriage had become a routine, devoid of the passion and excitement she once felt. She had fallen out of love with him, or so she convinced herself, even as she still held on to the comfort of their shared history. But even as the affair with Lucas intensified, a part of Sarah knew what she was doing was wrong. She couldn't avoid the shame that gnawed at her every time she looked at David, every time he kissed her goodnight, unaware of the lies she was living. Yet, the affair was too far gone, and the excitement was too intoxicating to quit. Lucas had become a drug for her, a dangerous one that was slowly eroding her sense of morality. She knew the moment would come when David would eventually discover the truth, but she wasn't prepared for how it would unfold. In her mind, she justified that maybe she didn't deserve to feel neglected, that David was the one who had allowed their marriage to fall apart. But what she hadn't anticipated was how David would respond to the ultimate betrayal, and the consequences that would follow. Then one night it happened. Sarah thought she was being careful. She thought she had everything under control. But David had finally begun to notice something strange. It was small things at first. Sarah's late-night phone calls, her increasing secretiveness, the text she quickly deleted when he walked into the room. And then, one fateful evening, David noticed something that sent a chill down his spine. As he opened Sarah's laptop to check his email, he saw an alert from her phone on the screen. An incoming message from Lucas. His heart skipped a beat. He had never seen this name before. David hesitated for a moment, then opened the message. It was a simple text, but it was enough to shatter everything. Can't wait to see you tonight. Don't worry about David. He'll never know. The blood drained from David's face as the reality of what he was reading sank in. For the first time, he felt the full weight of betrayal. The life he had built, the trust he had placed in his wife, was all a lie. He felt his heart break into 1,000 pieces. But more than that, he felt something darker rise within him. Anger, frustration, and a desire for retribution. His mind raced. He had to confront her. He had to know the truth. But what happened next would change everything for both of them. The following day, David couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. He was consumed with the text he had read the night before. Can't wait to see you tonight. Don't worry about David. He'll never know. The words echoed in his mind, over and over again. There was no doubt left in his mind. Sarah had been cheating on him. He wasn't sure how long it had been going on, but the evidence was right in front of him. He could feel his anger building, but so too did his sense of betrayal and heartache. He wasn't sure what to do first. Confront Sarah immediately, or give her time to come clean on her own. But he knew one thing for certain. He couldn't live in the dark anymore. The day dragged on, every minute feeling like an eternity. He worked through the morning in a haze, unable to focus, his mind replaying the discovery. In the late afternoon, David received a text from Sarah. Can you pick up dinner tonight? I'll be home late. She had no idea he knew what was happening. David felt the knot tighten in his chest. She's still lying to me, he thought, the hurt building up even more. His mind raced with questions. How long had it been going on? What was she doing behind his back? Why hadn't she just told him? He had given her everything. His love, his time, his devotion. Yet, in return, she had given him nothing but deceit. That evening, when Sarah walked in the door, David was already home, sitting in the living room with the laptop open in front of him. He was calm, too calm, but on the inside, everything was boiling over. He had carefully crafted his response. He wasn't going to confront her in a rash, emotional outburst. No, David wanted answers, and he wasn't going to let her hide behind any more lies. Sarah entered, greeting him casually, as if nothing was wrong. She leaned in to kiss him, but David pulled back just slightly, his gaze hardening. Where were you today, Sarah? He asked, his voice eerily calm. Sarah froze, confused by the tone in his voice. I told you I was at the gym. Why? Is that all you were doing? David's voice was still steady, but now there was an edge to it. Of course, Sarah replied, but there was a flicker of nervousness in her eyes. She knew something was off. What's wrong with you? You're acting weird. David didn't answer right away. Instead, he stood up, closing the laptop with a deliberate motion. He slowly walked toward her, his expression hardening. No. The real question is, what's wrong with you? Sarah's heart began to race. Her stomach twisted in knots. She could feel the tension in the air now, and it was suffocating. What are you talking about? She asked, trying to mask her unease with a forced laugh. David's eyes locked onto hers. You know exactly what I'm talking about. Lucas. Her face went pale. The blood drained from her cheeks. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. The silence between them stretched on, thick and heavy. David took a step closer, his voice now laced with cold fury. I read the messages, Sarah. The texts between you and Lucas. Don't try to deny it. I know. For a moment, Sarah stood there, completely frozen, her mind scrambling for an explanation, a way to twist the truth. But the reality of being caught hit her like a freight train. She felt exposed, vulnerable, and completely trapped. David, she began, her voice faltering. But David cut her off. his anger finally breaking through the facade he had been holding on to. "Don't even try to explain, Sarah. I've seen it all. The lies, the secret messages, the way you've been sneaking around behind my back. For how long, Sarah? How long have you been doing this to me?" Tears filled Sarah's eyes as she realized there was no going back. She had been caught. "David, I'm so sorry. I didn't mean for this to happen," she said, her voice trembling. It happened, and David shook his head, unable to listen anymore. He was no longer interested in her excuses. His heart was shattered, and all the anger that had been simmering inside him finally boiled over. "You didn't mean for it to happen?" he asked, his voice dangerously low. "You didn't mean for it to happen? That is what you have to say. You don't just fall into bed with another man, Sarah. You don't just betray someone like this and expect it to be okay. You chose to do this. You made this decision." Sarah's lip quivered as she finally spoke the words she had been dreading. I've been feeling neglected. You were never home. You never paid attention to me anymore. Lucas. He made me feel alive again. He gave me the attention I needed." David's eyes widened, not from surprise, but from the deep pain of hearing her admit it. "So, that's it? You cheat on me because you felt neglected? You thought it was okay to just throw everything away for some cheap thrill?" Tears streamed down Sarah's face, but David didn't soften. There was no sympathy in his eyes now. He had been hurt, betrayed, and now he was furious. He couldn't look at her the same way anymore. His mind was filled with 1,000 thoughts, but the one thing that stood out the most was this. She had broken his trust. And once trust was broken, it could never be fixed. "Get out," David said coldly, his voice like ice. "I need you to leave. I can't look at you right now." Sarah stood there in shock, unable to move. She had expected anger, yes, but not this kind of cold dismissal. It felt like the ground had been ripped from beneath her feet. But David didn't wait for a response. He turned his back on her and walked into another room, leaving her standing alone in the hallway. For a moment, Sarah didn't move. She stood there, her heart pounding in her chest. She had never imagined it would end like this. But as the realization set in, she felt something worse than betrayal. She felt the loss of everything she had taken for granted. David's response was swift and final. The story was far from over, but Sarah had no idea just how far David was willing to go to reclaim his dignity. And she would soon learn that there was more to David than she had ever realized. After the confrontation, David felt a strange sense of clarity. The anger was still there, but it had crystallized into something far more powerful, a need for control. Sarah had stolen his trust, his love, and shattered the life they had built together. But now the power was back in his hands. He could wallow in self-pity, or, he realized, he could make Sarah and Lucas feel the weight of their actions. But David wasn't going to lash out blindly. He had learned long ago that revenge didn't work if it was impulsive and messy. No, David was a strategist. His mind worked with precision, and this was no exception. He wasn't going to destroy Sarah out of anger. He was going to destroy her emotionally, make her realize the depth of the damage she had caused, and leave her with nothing to show for it. As the days passed, David kept a cool distance from Sarah. He didn't acknowledge her attempts at apology. He didn't respond to her messages. He simply let her stew in her own guilt and desperation, knowing that she was wondering how far he was willing to go. But David had already begun to lay his plan. David knew that Sarah's betrayal didn't just affect him. It affected their friends, their social circle, and even their professional lives. He was a businessman, and he knew how quickly things could unravel when someone's personal life became public knowledge. After a few days of silent treatment, David contacted a few key people in his and Sarah's social circle, people who admired her, people who looked up to her. He knew how important her reputation was to her. Sarah had always prided herself on being a perfect wife, a respectable woman in the eyes of their peers. That image was about to come crashing down. David carefully selected who to tell and when. He didn't want to create chaos, not yet. His goal was to plant seeds of doubt, to make Sarah feel the sting of public shame. He sent anonymous emails to a few of their closest friends, with just enough details to make them believe the affair had been going on much longer than Sarah had led anyone to believe. He attached a few carefully chosen photos, nothing explicit, but enough to imply the depth of the relationship. The emails hit their mark. Within hours, David began receiving messages from friends who were shocked by the revelation. But it wasn't just the shock that David was after. It was the ripple effect, the gossip, the whispers, the judgment that would soon follow. He knew how much Sarah valued her social status, and the thought of her friends turning on her was the first step in her emotional destruction. As expected, Sarah soon found out about the emails, and the humiliation was evident in her frantic calls to David. She begged him to stop, to not make this public. But David didn't respond to her. He simply let her suffer, knowing that the public humiliation would weigh heavily on her. He wanted her to experience the same betrayal, the same loss of control, the same helplessness that he had felt. While the emotional devastation was working its magic, David knew there was one more thing he could do to make Sarah realize the magnitude of her actions. He could hit her where it would hurt the most, her security. David had always handled the finances in their marriage. He had always been the one in control of the assets, the investments, and their joint accounts. Sarah had never been concerned about money. She had trusted David to manage everything. But now, David was about to take a very different approach. He called his financial advisor and instructed them to freeze all of Sarah's access to their joint accounts. He made sure she would have no access to the family's funds unless he approved it. He didn't remove everything. He left her with a small amount, just enough to get by, but he made sure she couldn't just walk away and continue her life without facing the consequences. David didn't want to bankrupt her. He wanted to ensure she would never feel safe again, never feel secure in the life she had taken for granted. He made it clear that, while he wasn't planning to leave her destitute, she would no longer have the luxury of living on his dime. Sarah's reaction was instantaneous. She called him in a panic, accusing him of being cruel, asking how he could do this to her. But David simply responded with cold indifference. "You made your choice, Sarah. Now live with the consequences." This, more than anything, made Sarah feel powerless. It was one thing to be publicly shamed, but to have her financial independence stripped away, to be reminded that David controlled everything she had grown accustomed to, it broke her. David's final step in his revenge was something that would ensure Sarah's emotional and psychological ruin. He decided that it was time for her to feel the full weight of her betrayal. He needed her to understand that the relationship she had destroyed, her marriage, her reputation, her trust, could never be repaired. David knew Sarah still had feelings for Lucas. Despite everything, she had spent months sneaking around with him, and David wasn't foolish enough to think she'd just forget about him. But what if Lucas were no longer available to her? What if she found herself abandoned by the one person who had made her feel wanted again? David set his final trap. He contacted Lucas, posing as a man who had found out everything. He knew how to play the game. He offered Lucas an ultimatum: leave Sarah for good or face the consequences. He painted a picture of how Sarah would ruin him, how her affair with him would cost him his reputation and his career. He threatened to expose everything to Lucas' employer, to his own family, to the very people who would never look at him the same way again if they knew what he had done. Lucas, scared of the repercussions, agreed to walk away from Sarah. He sent her a message one evening, breaking it off completely. The message was simple: "I can't do this anymore. It's over." When Sarah received the message, she went into a state of shock. The man who had made her feel so important, so alive, had left her without a second thought. She called him, she begged him to come back, but it was too late. In that moment, Sarah realized that her actions had consequences far greater than she had ever anticipated. She had lost David, she had lost Lucas, and now, she was left to pick up the pieces of her life, shattered by her own choices. David watched it all unfold from the sidelines. He didn't need to say a word. The silence between them spoke volumes. Sarah had been stripped of everything she had taken for granted: her affair, her financial security, and the man who once loved her unconditionally. David had taken back control, and with that control came his epic revenge. The days following David's final act of revenge were quiet, almost eerie. Sarah was left to face the wreckage of her life, a life she had once believed was secure, filled with love and privilege. Now everything was crumbling. Her financial independence had been taken away, her affair with Lucas exposed, and the man she had betrayed, the man who had loved her unconditionally, was no longer in her life. She found herself caught in a storm of guilt, shame, and loss. The emails that David had sent to her friends had already started to spread through their social circles. People who had once admired her now looked at her with judgment and pity. The whispers followed her wherever she went. Sarah tried to salvage what was left. She tried to reach out to her friends, apologizing and begging them to understand. But it was no use. The trust was gone, and so were most of her relationships. Even the ones who were willing to listen couldn't see her the same way anymore. Her perfect image had shattered, and now she was just another woman who had betrayed her husband for the thrill of a secret affair. But perhaps the hardest blow of all came when Lucas, the man she had thought would be her escape, rejected her completely. He had walked away from her without a second thought. She didn't just lose David. She had lost Lucas, too. That night, Sarah sat alone in their home, the place that once felt so comforting now feeling like a cold, empty shell. She looked around at the life she had taken for granted and wondered how it had all gone wrong. The affair, the lies, the betrayals, they had all seemed worth it in the moment. But now, in the silence of her loneliness, Sarah realized the price she had paid. The man she had loved was gone, and so was the man who had given her everything. The shame and guilt weighed heavily on her heart. She had tried to justify her actions to herself. She had told herself she deserved better than a distant husband, that she needed excitement and passion. But now she saw the truth. She had chosen the wrong path, and the consequences were irreparable. Meanwhile, across town, David was taking stock of the aftermath in his own way. While he had orchestrated Sarah's downfall with calculated precision, he had not done so without feeling the sting of betrayal himself. His heart was still heavy, though now he wore a mask of indifference. He had regained his dignity and his power, but it wasn't the victory he had imagined. He wasn't celebrating. Instead, he was reflecting. David had loved Sarah deeply. Their marriage had been a partnership in his eyes, a bond built on trust and shared dreams. But she had betrayed him in the worst possible way, emotionally, physically, and ultimately, in a way that left him questioning everything he thought he knew about her. Still, David knew that revenge hadn't made him feel whole again. It had just been necessary. He had taken back control, but at what cost? His heart, though healing, wasn't untouched. It would take time for him to rebuild fully. The pain of her betrayal, the anger, the hurt, it all needed time to dissipate. He knew that Sarah wasn't the only one who had been destroyed in this whole ordeal. He had to acknowledge his own role in the breakdown of their marriage. Yes, Sarah had been the one to cheat, but had he been emotionally absent? Had his focus on work contributed to her feeling neglected? David wasn't ready to forgive himself for the role he had played, even if Sarah's actions were unforgivable. In the weeks that followed, David withdrew from his social circles, choosing to spend his time alone. He didn't want to deal with the sympathy of others, nor did he want to hear their opinions on what had happened. He needed solitude to process, to heal, and to decide what kind of life he wanted to build next. His relationship with Sarah was over. There was no turning back, but his future was still unwritten. David began focusing on himself again, taking long walks in the evenings, visiting old friends, and re-engaging with the things that had once brought him joy. He spent more time at the gym, something he hadn't done in years, and started to rebuild his own self-esteem, piece by piece. He wasn't sure what his future held, but for the first time in a long while, he felt like he was taking control of it, not letting his pain dictate his actions. Sarah, on the other hand, was lost. She tried to piece together what was left of her life. She found herself having to start over, rebuilding her reputation from scratch. But it was far from easy. Her friends, the ones who had known her best, were now distant, and the social media posts she once shared about their perfect life were now reminders of a time that felt like a distant dream. Her career, once promising, seemed uncertain now that her personal life was exposed. She had betrayed everyone who trusted her, and the price was steep. The guilt that plagued Sarah was relentless. Every time she picked up the phone to try and make amends with someone, her family, her friends, even Lucas, she was met with silence or rejection. No one wanted to hear her excuses. She had burned too many bridges, and now she had to live with the fallout. As for Lucas, he moved on with his life. He was wary of anyone who tried to get too close, knowing that his brief affair with Sarah had been nothing but a mistake. He had lost his job, his reputation had taken a hit, and the friends he once trusted now saw him as a man who had caused chaos in the lives of others. It had been an exciting affair while it lasted, but in the end, Lucas learned the hard way that nothing good ever came from betraying someone else. In the end, both Sarah and David were left to pick up the pieces of their broken lives. Sarah had sought excitement and validation, but she lost everything in the process. Her marriage, her reputation, and even the man she had turned to for solace. The affair with Lucas, once so thrilling, turned out to be a fleeting moment of happiness, but the consequences of her actions would haunt her forever. She had betrayed the one person who had given her everything, and now she was left with the wreckage. David, on the other hand, walked away from the ordeal with his dignity intact. Though the scars of betrayal remained, he had taken back control of his life. The revenge he sought didn't bring him the closure he expected, but it did make him realize something important. He could survive without Sarah. In time, he would rebuild, stronger and wiser, but the pain of the past would always be a part of him. He had learned that sometimes the most powerful revenge isn't in the destruction of others. It's in reclaiming your own peace. The lesson here is clear. Trust, once broken, is incredibly hard to rebuild. Betrayal comes with consequences, and while revenge might feel satisfying in the moment, it's the ability to move forward that truly defines our strength. If you've enjoyed this story and want more intense tales of love, betrayal, and revenge, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss a new video. And we want to hear from you. What would you have done in David's shoes? Would you have chosen revenge, or would you have walked away? Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next story. Stay strong, stay smart, and never let anyone take your peace.